Well, good afternoon. As you can see, because I miss being in the classroom so much, I picked this up last year. This is my little dry erase board for home. I mean, after you've been teaching for 25 years, you're used to either having a chalkboard or a dry erase board. So let me start with this. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about paper number one, and this is your outline for paper number one. And I'm going to go through this here in a second and give you some suggestions as you start thinking about this paper. So let me start from here. I'll hold this up as I'm talking so that you can kind of follow along and write down some of these details. Hopefully you can see my handwriting. You know, I realize I probably should have made that writing a little bit bigger, but it's not the same as having a dry erase board in the classroom. But I'll do this for every one of the papers that we do. Sometimes I'll give you a structure or suggested outline on the directions themselves. Some of these earlier papers, I'll do it like this, where in a video, I'll kind of make suggestions for you. I like to simulate the in-class experience as much as I can with these online classes. So let's just imagine we're in a classroom in L building on campus, and I have a much bigger whiteboard that I'm writing on and giving these directions. So for paper number one, and the directions for that are on Blackboard. I'll talk more about that in a minute in terms of what's on the directions and how they'll be useful to you. This is the basic structure that I always recommend. And I've done this paper assignment a lot over the years. I've taught the Mike Rose essay for a long time. I've done different variations on this assignment, and it's always an interesting one. I enjoy reading these because, again, I get so many different stories in terms of jobs or volunteer experiences. So keep in mind that this is the structure that you're following. You're writing about a job experience that you've had, or you can write about someone else's experience if you haven't had a job before, or if if you haven't had one that you think you'd have enough to write about based on. You can ask somebody else. You can ask a parent or a sibling or a friend if you wanted to interview them. Most people decide to either write about a job experience that they've had, a particularly memorable one, or a volunteer experience, and all that's explained in the directions themselves. And we're using Toni Morrison and Mike Rose as our models, and I'll talk more about that here in a second too. Particularly Mike Rose. Mike Rose is especially important as a model for this paper. So this is the structure that you would use. So first thing to keep in mind is that this is essentially going to be 4, 5, maybe 6 paragraph essay. It's 3 pages. So again, I'll talk more about how you might break up the body paragraphs here in a second. But for your introduction for this paper, make sure that you do 2 things. This is very important, and this will become part of the main idea of that opening paragraph. Make sure, as I mentioned here on my whiteboard, that you're specific about what job it is you're going to be writing about. So what am I going to learn about in this paper? What job experience of yours? Or again, if you're writing about somebody else in an interview that you've done, maybe with a family member, what job experience did they have? Okay, so in other words, if you worked at Mariano's, I tend to get a lot of Mariano's papers because a lot of students will work there. Then be specific as to where you worked at Mariano's, like what was your role, or where do you work in the store if you're still working there. The other thing you want to make sure that you include in the opening paragraph is at least 2 to 3 skills that you needed to develop to do that job effectively. And this is where it's tying into Mike Rose, which I'll talk about in a second when I put the board down. So you want to introduce at least 2 to 3 skills that you had to develop in order to do that job successfully. Now, keep in mind, this may not have been a job you particularly liked. I'll give an example of that here in a couple of minutes. But try to pick something that you can really describe, that you can really give me a strong narrative about, and think about it from your perspective. Or again, if you're writing about someone else's experience and you've interviewed them, try to tell me something more about those skills. And that's something Mike Rose talks a lot about in his essay, particularly when he's talking about his mother, Rosie, which I'll get back to here in a second. Now, for the body of this paper, you're going to want to have at least 2 to 3 body paragraphs. And in those body paragraphs, you can talk about different experiences at the job, at the workplace, and how, again, you develop those skills. So you can even think about using the skills as a way to organize the middle of the essay, to organize the main ideas. What are the skills you developed? How did you develop them? Are there particular memories you have that bring to mind those skills and how you first developed them? So that's the body of the paper, and I have that listed here, paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, just as a way to kind of think about how to structure the middle of the essay. And then for your conclusion, as always, that's where you want to have your reflections on the experience, what you think about it now. If you're still doing the job or you're still at that particular workplace, you can explain what it's like for you now. The other thing that you want to make sure you're including at the ending is at least one quotation from Mike Rose, where you may be discussing what you think of his ideas. Maybe you can make a cross comparison with your experiences at a job and his mother Rosie's. So that's where you'd put in your direct quotation. And I'll do a separate video where I talk more about making sure that you're citing that correctly. Although there is, at the end of the directions for this paper, you're going to notice there's an overview of MLA, Modern Language Association format, which is what we use in English or literature classes like this, in terms of citing sources. But this is your basic structure for this paper. So it's pretty straightforward. Let me put this down. And again, if you have any questions, you can email me. But if I wanted to hold it up long enough so you could pause the video and write some of these details down. It's a narrative paper. You're telling a story, and all good writing, in my opinion, comes from good storytelling. And we have a capacity as human beings to tell strong stories. We have memories of things. We have people that have influenced us. We have that desire sometimes to figure out things from our past, to figure out how we got to where we are now. And so that this paper really does reflect what Mike Rose is doing, for example, in his essay. So I want you to think about that. You've noticed in some of the updates that I posted on Blackboard, I've talked a lot about the fact that the Mike Rose essay and the Toni Morrison essay are both models for this one because they're stories, right? Mike Rose is, in his case, not only his own story, because don't forget, he tells us his experiences in college, what those were like, how he struggled a little bit at first until he finally found the path that he wanted to take as an educator and as a professor, as a writer. He talks about his mother's experiences at the diner and how, as a lot of you mentioned in your quizzes correctly, she became interested in psychology because she had to use those things she learned from psychology, reading about it or thinking about it, in order to work not only with her coworkers, but especially with her customers at the diner, right? In terms of noticing what sort of mood they were in, how to get the best service to them, how to make sure she got a good tip also, in the workplace, in a very fast-paced workplace. So if you take a look again at the first part of the Mike Rose essay, that's a good model of the kind of narrative that I'm talking about here for this paper, because we see what kind of skills she needed to develop, that kind of compassion, that kind of empathy, again, that interest in psychology, so that she could do the job as best she could. Same thing with his uncle. We have that portion of the essay where he describes his uncle working at the automobile company and how he worked his way up and had different positions at different points in his career in the company, and how he was successful, but he had to sort of learn different skills depending on where he was needed at the company. So that idea of skills comes up again. In the Toni Morrison essay, which I'll talk about in a separate video this week, she also talks about skills, but there's a big emphasis in that one on family, and pay very, very close attention when you read that article to the ending and the advice that her father gives her at the end of the article, because that's where she's leading to throughout the whole essay. And again, I'll talk about that in a separate video this week in comparison to Mike Rose, but that's another example of a narrative essay. It's telling a story from her memory, and she's trying to figure out how she got to the point that she did as a successful novelist and teacher as an adult. And so you see that with both of these writers. They're reflecting back on the past and then trying to figure out how it got them to where they are today. And there's a lot of that for this article, or this paper that you're writing, where I'm asking you to reflect back on an experience either that you've had, or again, if you're thinking about asking somebody else, and some of you in your quizzes have said that to me, that you've thought about perhaps, interviewing a parent, for example, or one of your brothers or sisters. You're welcome to do that. Again, it all depends on what experiences you've had as a writer, or as I should say, as a worker, and how you're going to turn that into your writing in this particular paper. So again, it's a narrative paper, but it does have that structure of the skills, for example, that you needed to develop, how you develop those skills, and how that experience maybe relates, as I said, to the Mike Rose essay. And that one I would like you to use, as I said, at least one quotation from, so you can kind of compare your experience and your reflections on it to what he says in his essay about having to develop these different kinds of skills, especially for different kinds of jobs. And he talks a lot about blue collar kinds of jobs, but what he's saying is also applied to really any kind of workplace situation, no matter where you are. Let me give you an example. I'll tell you a story, since I'm asking you to tell me a story. The job that I had, I did it for 2 summers. Summer before my first year of college. So before I was a first year student, as many of you are this semester. And the summer between sophomore and junior year, yeah, I also worked at a factory. So I worked at a factory back in Connecticut, where I'm from, in Naugatuck, Connecticut, which is another town over from where I grew up. And this company that I worked for, that's those 2 summers, made a lot of different glass products. So they primarily, well, I shouldn't say primarily. They did, for example, if you've ever wondered who manufactured the glass on the dials or the gauges on a plane, on a jet, that's what this company did that I worked for. Okay, that I worked those 2 summers for. What they mainly did, though, aside from making those kind of high precision parts for the aerospace industry, is they also made mirrors, and they made mirrors especially for makeup companies. So compacts like this one, they were made at this company in Naugatuck, Connecticut, and it was a factory. So I worked in the factory for 2 summers, and I had different positions. One of them, as I said, was taking the mirrors off of the machine. So these are these giant sheets of glass that had just been turned into mirrors. And this machine was really long. It took up, it's hard to even describe it. I mean, it was the space of this entire section of the factory, this really long machine. So the glass would go in at one end. So there'd be 1 or 2 workers at the front end of the machine, and the glass hadn't been coated yet. It would go through this machine, and then it would turn into a mirror. Now, how I did that, I don't know. I don't remember how I did it. It was interesting. I think at the time they did explain to me how it coated the glass and it turned it into the mirror and all this stuff. But on the other end, it would come out, it would be washed, it would be cleaned up, and I would have to put these big sheets of mirrored glass, which would eventually be cut down to this size out of these giant sheets, into like a crate, basically, that was near me at the end of this sort of assembly line, I guess, if you want to call it that. And I was terrible at this job. I was terrible at it because I didn't have the right, at least at first, I had the wrong coordination. I was distracted. And so I broke a lot of mirrors. I got to be honest. I broke a lot of mirrors to the point where they did it a couple of points, switched me to different parts of the factory. I was better on the washing machines or the beveling machines that would take the little pieces of glass and then cut them out in the right shapes on these smaller compacts. Anyway, that's another story. I did better at those machines. But I learned a lot from doing that job. It might sound, as Mike Rose says in his essay, that how could I have learned anything from that I could apply later on? Because I didn't, go into manufacturing, and I didn't go into business. I went into teaching. But let me tell you something. I learned a lot from that job. And if I were writing this paper, here are some of the things that I would talk about if I were to go back and do an essay about this. I had to learn patience because it was very repetitive work. So I had to learn how to be patient, how to be present, to use that term, how to be present in the moment so that I wasn't breaking all this glass all over the place, which was dangerous, by the way, obviously, because it's shards of glass everywhere. So I learned a lot about patience, about how to concentrate. I mean, in some ways, I almost had to learn how to meditate, to be perfectly honest, so that I could keep up with these pieces of glass just relentlessly coming at me on this machine. So patience was definitely one of the virtues that I had to learn. Whether I learned it very well or not, you'd have to ask my family and friends, I guess, to see that. But that was one thing I really had to learn. And I learned it by watching. And so again, if I were writing this paper, I would have one paragraph maybe where I would describe in the body of the essay how I learned this from watching my coworkers, because some of them had done this for a long time and they had gotten into the rhythm of it. They were really good at it. They knew, aside from the fact that they knew the machine and its quirks and probably how to repair it too. A lot of them really had the technical expertise to go in there and fix this thing up if it started to get a little out of whack. They also clearly had established a rhythm, so they were able to concentrate. They knew how many of these sheets of glass they had to remove from the assembly line, how many they had to get into the crates efficiently, so that the next department could then take the next step for the manufacturing process. So that was interesting. Even seeing that manufacturing process up close was actually really fascinating. So that's one example that I have. Let me give you at least one more. I won't give you 3 of them, but I'll just give you one more so as not to make the video too long. The other thing that I learned was working with a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds. So that was really fascinating because, again, I just come out of high school. I didn't have a lot of experience. And so I learned a lot about how to use my Spanish skills, by the way, from my Spanish classes in high school, because some of my coworkers spoke both English and Spanish, but some of them, their Spanish was better. Some of my coworkers were Portuguese, and Portuguese and Spanish are not super close, but they're close enough that I remember having one coworker that we were able to communicate because I could sort of speak with him in Spanish, and he could speak with me in Portuguese. My reading in Spanish and my writing is better than my speaking skills, and now I'm not sure how good they are after all these years. But at the time, having just come out of high school, they were pretty good. So I learned how to use those skills that I'd had that I wasn't sure how I would necessarily apply, but there was a practical situation where I could use that language skill with my coworkers so that we could work together really effectively. And so learning how to work with different people from all kinds of different walks of life and learning about their lives and their stories was part of the job that was really fun. It was really interesting. I remember one of my coworkers, I'll just give you one more story, had seen all these great bands in the 1960s, like Jimi Hendrix, and I think he'd gone to Woodstock and all those great old classic rock bands or whatever. And so he'd tell me about those shows, like what it was like to see all those groups. He didn't remember all the shows that he'd seen, but those were good experiences, and I met a lot of cool people who were really nice that I stayed in touch with, that I would never have probably met. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to if I hadn't worked at that job. That's one of the nice things about taking different jobs at different places, even if they're imperfect and they're flawed. Sometimes you come away from the job with a friendship, or someone that you'll learn a lot from, or that you really admire. So again, just to give that example, my experience of working in the glass making, mirror making factory 30 something years ago taught me a lot of skills that I had to take into teaching about working with different sorts of people from all different walks of life, different kinds of professors from different places, different students who have different life experiences. I got some training in that by working at the factory. Same thing about that. Attempt to be patient, and to do the best I could to get the job completed as effectively as possible. So those were skills that I learned at that job that I was able to transfer over when I started doing tutoring and teaching as an undergraduate, especially when I really decided that I wanted to go into teaching when I was probably a sophomore in high school is when not high school, I had no idea. But in college, when I was a sophomore, I started working as a writing tutor. And it was amazing how many of those skills that I learned at the factory applied very well to working with other students on their papers, having to be patient with them, having to encourage and support them, which is what we did at the factory, because those are not easy jobs. If you've ever done a factory job, they're really physically demanding, aside from being mentally demanding. Because of the technology involved. And again, this technology was not as sophisticated as the kind of things that we have today. So that's just an example. And I wanted to mention that, first of all, to encourage you to take a look at the directions. The directions for paper number 1 are in Blackboard. You'll see them. Just open up the readings, quizzes, and writings section, and you'll see it towards the top. I'm actually going to move those today now that we've done the first quiz. Please let me know if you have any questions. Check the due dates for the papers too, because as I said, I have 4 different sections of 101. So some of you don't all have the same due date. So please take a look at Blackboard. And take a look at when your due date is for the paper. And as I always say, if you have a draft that you'd like me to read, send it along. I'll be happy to take a look at it. And again, tell me a story. What job experience have you had, or has someone around you had, that you'd like to write about in detail? Because it should be a fun paper. It should be descriptive. And sometimes I often get some really interesting stories. One semester, just one last thing, I had, I think, half a class that all worked at different parts of the same Marianos. Only 2 of them knew each other. So it became an interesting class discussion as they were comparing their experiences at the Mariano. Some had a good experience, some less so. That was a couple of years ago. It sort of felt like reading Lord of the Rings or seeing those movies, but if they were all set at Mariano's, it was like this epic story of the Marianos. And I forget if it was in Palatine or I don't remember where it was now, which of the towns near campus it was at. But at any rate, That's some details on paper number one. Think a little bit about it. Please let me know if you have any questions. The next video that I will do this week, I'll talk more specifically about these two readings, the Toni Morrison that you're reading for this week, and how it compares to the Mike Rose. All right. So if you have any questions, like I said, send me an email. I hope you have a great day. It's nice out today, so enjoy the nice weather and the lack of humidity. And I will talk to you in the next video. See you then. Bye.